intervention in the realism-anti-realism debates turns on his insistence that experimentation is not a theory-laden practice in the Kuhnian sense, but a complex set of practices in their own right. But granting experimentation its due need not entail leaving behind, ensnared in the trap of representationalism. This asymmetry in his conceptualization of experimenting versus theorizing is implicated in his asymmetrical realist stance. Realism towards entities, but not theories. But how realistic is Hacking's account of theorizing? The physicist Niels Bohr takes issue with the notion of theorizing as representing. In Bohr's proto-performative account, which I discuss in detail in Chapter 3, theorizing must be understood as an embodied practice, rather than a spectator sport of matching linguistic representations to pre-existing things. Concepts in Bohr's account are not mere ideation, but specific physical arrangements. In the absence of due consideration to this crucial point, Bohr believes that scientists can only speculate about mere abstractions, and in so doing, they fail to provide an objective account of the phenomena they are studying. Indeed, a failure to correctly identify the objective referent accounts for many of the paradoxical features of quantum theory. While Hacking distinguishes between intervening and representing, associating the former with experimental practice and the latter with theory production, I argue that Bohr's proto-performative account suggests that scientific practices may more adequately be understood as a matter of intervening rather than representing, on all counts, that is, with respect to all dimensions of this complex web of practices. Or perhaps intervening isn't the appropriate verb for describing the activity at issue. In either case, as we will see. Ironically, then, Hacking could be accused of making a caricature of theorizing in much the same way that he points out that some philosophers are reductive in their considerations of the complex practice of experimenting. One particularly interesting counterpoint to Hacking's notion of scientific theories is the practice-based account of scientific theorizing offered by Peter Galison, a historian of science, in his study of how Einstein arrived at his special theory of relativity. Galison argues that the theory of special relativity did not hatch full-blown from the head of Einstein, the result of a solitary mind occupied with a flurry of abstract ideas. Rather, the central idea of clock coordination was an important problem of great practical significance in Europe in the early 1900s, and Einstein's seat at the patent office offered him a first-hand view of a multitude of proposed new technological solutions to the problem. When Einstein came to the Bern patent office in 1902, he entered into a world in which the triumph of the electrical over the mechanical was already symbolically wired to dreams of modernity. He found a world in which clock coordination was a practical problem, trains, troops, and telegraphs, demanding workable, patentable solutions in exactly his area of greatest concern and professional occupation: precision electromechanical instrumentation. The patent office was anything but a deep-sea lightship. No, the office was a grandstand seat for the great parade of modern technologies. And as coordinated clocks went by, they weren't traveling alone. The network of electrical coordination signified political, cultural, and technical unity all at once. Einstein seized on this new conventional simultaneity machine and installed it as the principal beginning of his new physics. In a certain sense, he had completed the grand time coordination project of the 19th century, but by eliminating the master clock and raising the conventionally set time to a physical principle, he had launched a distinctively modern 20th century physics of relativity. Social, technological, and scientific practices that included the entangled apparatuses of colonial conquest, democracy, world citizenship, anti anarchism, trains, telegraphs, clocks, and other electromechanical devices composed of wires and gears all played a role in the production of the special theory of relativity. What was at stake, according to Gallison, was always practical, and more than practical, at once material economic necessity and cultural imaginary. Isn't an abstract idea for Einstein. Time is what we measure with a clock. As Bohr argues and Gallison examples beautifully illustrates, ideas that make a difference in the world don't fly about free in the weightiness of their material instantiation. To theorize is not to leave the material world behind and enter the domain of pure ideas, where the lofty space of the mind makes objective reflection possible. Theorizing, like experimenting, is a material practice. In fact, once theory and experiment are no longer understood in their reified forms, but seen as dynamic practices of material engagement with the world, we can see that these sets of practices are completely entangled in ways that representationalist views of science, which treat theory and experiment as separate domains with one or the other as dominant or primary, elide. Which is not to say that theorists and experimentalists are trained the same way or engage in the same set of practices, but rather to appreciate the fact that both theorists and experimentalists engage in the intertwined practices of theorizing and experimenting. Furthermore, despite Hacking's best intentions to leave representationalism beliefs behind, his entity realism takes on board one of the representationalism's fundamental metaphysical assumptions: the view that the world is composed of individual entities with separately determined properties. Indeed, most forms of realism presuppose a metaphysics that takes for granted the existence of individual entities, each with its own roster of non-relational properties. As such, realism is often saddled with essentialism. But realism need not subscribe to an individualist metaphysics or any other representationalist tenet. Indeed, I would argue that any realist account worth its salt should not endorse such idealist or magical beliefs. Realness does not necessarily imply thingness. What's real may not be an essence, an entity, or an independently existing object with inherent attributes. The assumption of thingness remains in place at the base of Hacking's entity realism. Words and things are still the order of the day. Like Hacking, I am interested in non-representationalist realist account of scientific practices that takes the material nature of practices seriously. Not Hacking's realism towards entities, but rather realism towards phenomena and the entangled material practices of knowing and becoming. Phenomena, according to my agential realist account, are neither individual entities nor mental impressions, but entangled material agencies, to be discussed more fully below. The agential realist understanding that I propose is a non-representationalist form of realism that is based on an ontology that does not take for granted the existence of words and things, and an epistemology that does not subscribe to a notion of truth based on their correct correspondence. Agential realism offers the following elaboration of Hacking's critique of representationalism. Experimenting and theorizing are dynamic practices that play a constitutive role in the production of objects and subjects in matter and meaning. As I will explain, theorizing and experimenting are not about intervening from outside, but about interacting from within and as part of the phenomena produced. Agential realism is explicated in Chapter 4 and subsequent chapters, For now, I want to return to the question of metaphysics. Importantly, it is precisely on the same point that one encounters in crossing the threshold between representationalism and performativism, namely the metaphysics of individualism. That many other science studies approaches stumble as well, although the issue that they trip over is often quite different. Like hacking, most science studies scholars are not apt to take the objective scientific practices for granted. Rather, they are too interested in investigating the details of the laboratory practices that produce them. Unlike hacking, however, actor network theorists, among others, have disassembled the belief that what scientists make evidence through their practices is the existence of discrete objects. On the contrary, they have emphasized that the efficacy of the scientific endeavor depends on specific procedures for making networks or assemblages of humans and non-humans. That is, things, in the sense, are surely not the order of the day. Ironically, however, mainstream science studies approaches, and even some feminist science studies approaches, take it as a given that social variables like gender, race, nationality, class, and sexuality are properties of individual persons, thereby reinstalling the metaphysics of individualism. The taken for granted object nature of things gets dislodged, but questions related to discursive practices, especially those Foucault would consider to be at the crux of the discourse power-knowledge nexus, such as the discursive constitution of the subject, are neglected. Lest this important point be misunderstood in a particularly ironic fashion. It is perhaps worth emphasizing that this is not to say that subject production is all about language. Indeed, that's precisely Foucault's point in moving away from questions of linguistic representation and focusing instead on the constitutive aspects of discursive practices in their materiality. Building on Foucault's critique of the representationalism, Judith Butler's influential theory of gender performativity theorizes the gendered constitution of the subject. As Butler emphasizes, gender is not an attribute of individuals. Rather, gender is a doing, not in the sense that there is a pre-gendered person who performs its gender, but rather with the understanding that gendering is, among other things, the differentiating relations by which subjects come into being, and the matrix through which all willing first becomes possible. Gendering, Butler argues, is a temporal process that operates through the reiterations of norms. In other words, Butler is saying that gender is not an inherent feature of individuals, some core essence that is variously expressed through acts, gestures, and enactments, but an iterating doing through which subjects come into being. But these are precisely the kinds of points that one would think that actor networks theorists and other scholars attuned to looking for ways in which objects emerge through scientific practices would be especially attentive to. And yet there has been surprisingly little cross-pollination between feminist post-structuralist theory and science studies. Even in the feminist science studies literature, one is hard-pressed to find other direct engagements with Butler's work on performativity. Science studies approaches that fail to take these insights into account are not simply setting aside a variable or two that can easily be added into analyses at a later date. Rather, they make the same kind of mistake as the representationist approaches they reject. They fail to take account of the constitutive nature of practices. Indeed, as Butler and Bohr emphasize, that which is excluded in the enactment of knowledge discourse power practices plays a constitutive role in the production of phenomena. Exclusions matter both to bodies that come to matter and those excluded from mattering. Crucially, there are epistemological, ontological, and ethical issues at stake. This applies both to the practices that are being observed, e.g., laboratory practices, and to the knowledge-making practices that contribute to the science studies literature. But the mere acknowledgement of the fact that science studies scholars are actors involved in performing their own set of practices doesn't go nearly far enough. Turning the mirror back on oneself is not the issue, and reflexivity cannot serve as corrective here. Rather, the point is that these entangled practices are productive, and who and what are excluded through these entangled practices matter. Different interactions produce different phenomena. Or so I will argue, but I'm jumping ahead of myself here. The point is this: one can't simply bracket or ignore certain issues without taking responsibility and being accountable for the constitutive effects of these exclusions. Since science studies needs to take account of gender and other crucial social variables for the sake of consistency at the very least, and since it no doubt wants to avoid reinstalling the metaphysics of individualism or other representationalist remnants into its theories, its methods, and its results, turning to performative accounts of gender to find out what they have to offer at least seems like a good place to start. I want to emphasize in the strongest terms possible that it would be a mistake to think that the main point is simply a question of whether or not gender, race, sexuality, and other social variables are included in one's analysis. The issue is not simply a matter of inclusion. The main point has to do with power. How is power understood? How are the social and the political theorized? Some science studies researchers are endorsing Bruno Latour's proposal for a new parliamentary governmental structure that invites non-humans as well as humans. But what, if anything, does this proposal do to address the kinds of concerns that feminist, queer, post-colonial, post-Marxist, and critical race theorists and activists have brought to the table? Non-humans are in, but the concerns of this motley crew of theorists and activists seem not to have been heard, let alone taken into account. Indeed, their presence has barely been acknowledged. Not that they, or we, are standing in line waiting to be granted entrance into the halls of power. In his books, Politics of Nature, Bruno Latour deftly exposes the modernist constitution for its illicit bicameral assemblies, the House of Sciences, which claims to represent things as they are, and the House of Politics, which claims to represent humans' concerns and the faulty notions of representation they evoke. I couldn't agree more that the old bicameralism that split the governmental houses into separate powers with nature on one side and the social on the other is broken. But it can't simply be repaired by making a new bicameralism and a new representationalist form of government. The political field is not limited to the state house, and representationalist governments have a long history of shoring up their own borders while raiding and ravaging other lands. What conception of power, what model of citizenship, what immigration policy is being enacted when a new representationalist democracy is being proposed that only acknowledges two kinds of citizens and their offsprings: the fully human, those who had already been granted citizenship, and the fully non-human and their hybrids. Haraway, in 1985, long ago emphasized that this would not be sufficient. Cyborg politics are not merely about the cross between a human and a machine, but also about the techno-biopolitics of the differentially human and their motley kin. As Butler puts it, it is not enough to claim that human subjects are constructed, for the construction of the human is a differential operation that produces the more and the less human, the inhuman, the humanly unthinkable. Any proposal for a new political collective must take account of not merely the practices that produce distinctions between the human and the non-humans, but the practices through which their differential constitution is produced. All the efforts to unseat epistemological representationalism of the House of Science will be undercut if the political and social field is theorized yet again in terms of political and linguistic forms of representationalism. Representationalism, with its metaphysics of individualism, will simply be reinstalled as the order of the day. This is one reason why science studies cannot afford to ignore the insights that our best political and social theorists have to offer. Post-structuralism offers a notable alternative to representationalism. Post-structuralism is not just some high-tech toy that humanities scholars use to entertain themselves. Post-structuralist approaches aim to take seriously the concerns of the motley crew, while offering alternative understandings of power and subject formation, displacing the modernist obsession with representationalist problematic, while furthermore including an examination of the constitutive effect of exclusion.